Yeah.
Oh, we're already recording. Greetings and thanks for participating in today's webinar from Real Story Group. This is Scott Dill. I'm on the business development team, and as you see, our founder and CEO, Tony Byrne, is here with us as well. And today we're going to take you through the right way to select marketing technology. As an organization that focuses entirely on the MarTech stack, this is obviously a topic that's near and dear to our hearts, and it's something that we're really excited to share with you today. So thank you for taking time out of your busy days to join us. We certainly appreciate your participation. I see folks from all around the world, some that are customers, some that are first-time webinar attendees. So welcome and thanks for joining us. A couple ground rules here as we get started. I do want to let you know that we are in fact recording today's session, so you will be able to access a recording of this on our website later on this week. The slides will be sent to you from our marketing team as well. And then I do also want to mention that we should have time at the end for questions. So if you have questions or feedback that you want to share, please enter those into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. As we get started, I do want to provide a little bit of background about Real Story Group for folks that are new to us, or even as a refresher for those who have come back to us. As you'll see here, this is our entire world. We focus entirely on the MarTech or the Omnichannel tech stack. And what the subway map illustrates, and this is a latest version of our subway map, fresh, hot off the press over the last week or so. But you'll see here that there are a number of subway lines on the map. So we cover in our research areas like web content management, digital asset management, marketing automation, customer data platforms, and a number of others. And the way we can engage with you is in a variety of ways. We'll detail more at the end of today's session, but one thing to think about as we're going through, not only does Tony provide these webinars, but you can have direct access to him as part of our advisory services. So if what he's saying resonates with you today and it's something that you could benefit from moving forward, having more direct access as you think about your MarTech stack or maybe one technology area in particular, let us know. We can have some further discussions after today's session. So Tony, I'll turn things over to you to take us through today's presentation. Tony?
Great, thanks, Scott. This really marries up two longtime passions of mine, which is finding the right MarTech vendor that's the best fit for you through a more realistic, agile selection process, and then really evaluating the vendors themselves, like what are their pros and cons. And so this webinar kind of brings those two together. I actually founded Real Story Group 20 years ago now, based on this quadrant you see on the left. I was looking at a systems integration firm, and we subscribed to major analyst firm research, and we're really disappointed with it. We found it often too fawning for major vendors, not critical enough. Didn't really get to the underlying issues of use case and fit. They were kind of static quadrants, and our experience working with some of the vendors who were in the upper right really didn't mirror what was being said in the analyst world. So I decided to start my own analyst firm to tell the real story about what's going on. And along the way, we made a very early decision that we would never work for or advise vendors at all. And so that gives us the independence to provide what we believe is the toughest, hardest hitting research and evaluation. And also along the way has really focused us on advising you, which is the enterprise customer of these tools. And along that journey, then, we've helped a number of you, really hundreds of companies over the last 2 decades, select technology. And along the way, then, we encapsulated those lessons into a particular methodology that I'm going to share here today. There's going to be really 3 main themes for this half hour together. And the first one is really kind of forward-looking, which is now more than ever, you need to be thinking about selecting marketing technology in a bigger context. So the bigger context of your overall stack, the evolution of that stack, and the interaction with capabilities and other customer-facing services that might be outside of the rubric of marketing. In other words, I think a little bit larger than marketing. So now more than ever, we need to be thinking about the big picture. For most of us, throughout the 2010s, has kind of bequeathed us a legacy of this sort of picture, which is the silo problem. We've had this tremendous expansion, this tremendous horizontal expansion of engagement silos. And the problem is that many of these tools then kind of expanded vertically to include their own content management, their own data management, their own rules, their own planning, their own analytics. And so what we have are these platforms that in many cases are extremely sophisticated. We spent a lot of time and money over the last decade sort of modernizing them and building up the teams to manage what are often some fairly sophisticated platforms around web, email, mobile, call centers, point of sale, social, everything else. But the problem is that we now have, as we look at this from a customer perspective, which has really accelerated, of course, during the pandemic, we have very inconsistent experiences. And the way that we've all been trying to address this over the last decade is to do all of this kind of horizontal integration. Let's connect our Salesforce to our email, to our website, to our point of sale, to our call center. And it's just not working. It's too much of a many-to-many problem. And then you lie on top of that, many of you have combined business models around B2B as well as B2C, in some cases B2B2C, and so on and so forth, that this world simply is not scaling for us. And so as you think about then bringing new technology, selecting new technology, marketing technology, either a platform you don't have or a replacement, you really want to be targeting a different reference model. And so this is what Real Story Group has been really advocating for the past year or so as kind of a reference model for the 2020s, where you still are going to have these different engagement silos, but you will have decoupled or abstracted out some really core services around omnichannel operations, unified customer data, we believe really table stakes for this, journey orchestration, omnichannel content, which is really just sort of emerging, and then certainly customer intelligence, some of the enterprise customer data services at a lower level that many of you have been maturing over the past decade. Now we really need to leverage that in terms of the sorts of models that are going to drive better customer experience going forward. And the key thing, though, that's happening here, though, is extracting these services from where they were trapped, which is in individual engagement platforms. And so this means really rethinking your stack, we believe, for the 2020s. And this is what we call a reference model for the Omnichannel CX Stack. So a reference model means that it's somewhat generic. When we work with subscribers and clients, we typically modify these for their existing circumstances. But the general idea you can see here, which is that you have these various engagement channels at the top, various interaction delivery environments underneath them, and then these content and engagement management platforms you see in the first colored layer in the middle. And that's what many of us have been spending a lot of time, in many cases a lot of money, trying to modernize and make heftier, but that has also led us down the dark alley that many of those capabilities, the data, the content, the decisioning is then trapped within those specific platforms. So we think the future really relies in kind of some of the energy going lower in your stack into what we describe as enterprise foundation platforms. These are capabilities around personalization, orchestration, customer data, intelligence hubs, and operations that are not bound to a particular department, are not necessarily bound to a particular channel or a particular engagement venue, but are independent and so therefore can work across your stack. So these are really foundational pieces. And, in an ideal world, we would have built these foundational pieces first. Now, many of you are sort of backing into them. But nevertheless, it's never too early to be thinking about this and moving in this direction. And this then provides a whole new context for the sorts of decisions that you're going to want to make all up and down your stack, because it changes really the whole kind of services architecture going forward. We sometimes call this Pilates for your stack, where these enterprise foundation platforms are going to be doing more decision making, and then your content and engagement platforms then maybe doing more order taking. And the good news is that means that you can potentially simplify at this tier. And we're in fact working with some very forward-looking enterprises right now about how they can simplify in that tier, even as they add more complexity and more sophistication and more value kind of lower in their stack. So you have a couple of different things to think about. On the one hand, you have some choices to make as far as what are these platforms going to be in your enterprise foundation. But then secondly, as you look at potentially replacing some of the capabilities in your content and engagement management tier, you can also think about kind of getting simpler. And there's a lot of really interesting things happening here right now. So certainly in the ESP and marketing automation platform space, we're seeing some enterprises converting to simpler, cheaper services that are more CDP friendly, that can work with your CDP platform where most of the data management is happening, and you just rely on these sorts of platforms for messaging. You can do it much cheaper and much simpler going forward. Similar story with respect to DAM, where you can maybe focus your DAM on more brand asset management as you push some complexity lower in your stack to omnichannel content platforms. Certainly we're seeing in the WCM side where simpler hybrid architectures are beginning to prevail over some of the more heavyweight omnibus platforms that are too internally excessively robust and slowing people down, and instead having a lighter weight WCM on top of a core foundation. And then maybe most intriguingly, because here's where so much money is spent, is this idea of maybe CRM as a service rather than CRM as kind of a data dump on both especially the B2B side, but also B2C. We think that this could seriously decomplicate your environment and get around this problem of spending tens of millions of dollars on Salesforce integration going forward. So the first story here is, you're going to have to think about the broader context going forward as you think about these tool sets. And one of the implications is that you may be able to get lighter at the engagement tail, and lighter is always better, as long as it's working for you. But then the second thing that this suggests is that, you want to avoid this idea that a single vendor can build your entire stack for you, because it's just becoming, first of all, too big and too complicated. But also, there's no vendor here that's going to provide you best fit solutions across all of these. And the incumbent vendors, and not just Salesforce, but also Adobe and Acquia and others, are very, very, very heavily invested in their content and engagement management platforms, much less invested in enterprise foundation platforms, which they see as a threat. So the key story here is never let an incumbent vendor build your stack for you. A stack is what you build yourself. It could be that major vendors like Salesforce, Oracle, Adobe, and others may be key pieces of your stack, but you never want to turn over the stack decision-making to a single vendor itself. So a couple of stories here in this first part of the webinar. You need to think about whatever technology you're selecting as part of a bigger fabric of systems. And that fabric is changing, and in particular, a lot of the energy is going lower in your stack, and this is a good thing for your customer. Okay, that was the first story. Second story here is around applying design thinking. And this has really come out of 20 years of advising our research subscribers who license our hard-hitting research to find out the true weaknesses and strengths of these different vendors. And often they're doing this, not always, but often in the context of an actual selection process. So we've gotten visibility into a lot of selections over the past couple of decades, and we've seen a lot of things go wrong. And if I could generalize around that, it was mostly because organizations were taking a waterfall type approach rather than applying design thinking or modern agile-ish approach to this challenge. And this ultimately provoked my colleague Jared and I to write a book called The Right Way to Select Technology, which is really an encapsulation of this more design thinking methodology. So what was this in response to? This was really in response to kind of 4 or 5 traditional approaches to vendor evaluations that have not worked out well for you and your peers. So the first one is love at first sight. We see that all the time in the MarTech space. Like, oh my God, I saw this incredible vendor at this booth, at this show, or at a webinar. I need them. They're the only ones who can work for me. And we all know that love at first sight rarely leads to long-lasting relationships. All vendors have competitors. You want to definitely do your research. The second one is what we call My Cousin Vinny, which is some other organization in my segment licensed a certain vendor, so I should license that vendor as well. The reality is that two companies, even within the same industry, can have radically different business models and maturity levels and organizational models. And so, yes, definitely rely on your peers, but don't just license something because another firm got it. The third one is the horse race kind of methodology. Who's ahead? Who's behind? This is what Gartner and Forrester really push. They're almost always wrong in their handicapping. This doesn't speak to what's a good fit for you. The key thing is what's a good fit for you. And the fourth approach, which we've been seeing quite a bit over the last 2 decades, never seems to go away, is this endless analysis where I build all these long spreadsheets and try to do this mathematical sorting and all these features and get people to rank the features, and everybody's ranking all the features number one. And, it just leads to a lot of analysis, paralysis by analysis. And you definitely want to replace that with a more agile approach. The fifth one we see a lot in MarTech, and this is the idea that we already have an existing tool. So let's say I'm a marketer and I need to drill a small hole in a piece of wood every Monday, and somebody comes along and says, well, I've got this drill press. We just have to bring it outside and have you do it. Well, that doesn't really work, right? These sort of heavyweight solutions, just because they happen to come from an incumbent, usually end up getting in the way. So here again, the emphasis should really be on what's the right fit. But what's the right fit is a real challenge. I mean, if you just take the CDP landscape, which like most of these you saw from our subway map, highly fragmented landscapes, the major vendors typically underperforming in this market, still leaves you a good 24 pure play platforms. So how do you choose among them? These are all legitimate vendors that have legitimate case studies, but they all do have their strengths and weaknesses. So how do you go about actually vetting it when you have so many choices? So again, we really encourage you to lean on the precepts of design thinking, which are business-focused, team-based, empirical, and then iterative and adaptive. And so this means you don't have to get your requirements perfect right up front. So let's talk in a little bit more detail what this actually means if we're looking at, say, selecting the CDP. I'll remind you again that you can always use the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel to ask any questions or share any comments or anecdotes. And then we'll be sure to have time to answer those in the end. So the larger question here is, how do I filter down if I've got there's 30 plus vendors in the DAM, WCM, CDP, certainly ESP spaces. So these are highly fragmented marketplaces. How do I filter down? Well, the first thing you want to do is create your own user stories. So these are actual ways that real humans, both your own marketing teams as well as your prospects and customers, are going to be interacting with this technology. That's the most important thing, because you don't want the vendors telling their stories. They're very good at that. Their stories are always very appealing, but they're not your stories. So first of all, you have to create your own narrative around this. And secondly, you want to use your top business cases and use cases to match up against the marketplace. You can come down to a short list of maybe 6 to 8 vendors. Then you review proposals and demos, ideally get down to 4 vendors. Again, the proposals and demos are based primarily around your stories. You're going to modify these over time and then ultimately get to a hands-on bake-off with 2 finalists. And I'll talk about the bake-off in a minute, really critical piece. You optionally may then want to do some security or integration or other testing with a single finalist that's going to be a little bit more involved. So the idea here is that you invest more time and effort and you get closer to reality as you narrow down the list of vendors. So you don't have to get it perfect right up front. You want to have a good set of user stories and then filter your way from there. So this means spending less time in Excel and more time in Word or Google Docs or whatever it is that you use. We actually did this most recently with one of our subscribers in a Confluence space. Doesn't matter. It's just a place where you can tell a story, and your marketers should be very good at this, about a particular business objective that you're trying to create. Who are the people involved? What's the background? What do you want to have happen? And this is part science, part art. You don't want to be too prescriptive. You want to be more descriptive and have the vendor with all their rich experience help you understand how they can then achieve this story through a proposal, through a demo, ultimately through a hands-on bake-off for the 2 finalists. Now, the interesting thing about this technology we've learned is that there's many potential use cases that you can focus on. So when we're evaluating, for example, CDP vendors, we use 10 kind of canonical use cases when we look at what do these particular tools excel at. And what's interesting to us is that typically, in a typical distribution of this, is that a vendor will excel at maybe 2, 3, or 4 of these, be okay at 2 or 3, and then either perform very poorly or proactively ignore some other use cases. And that's not a bad thing, because oftentimes a jack of many trades is a master of none. So the idea is to try to match up against vendors that are the right fit for what you're trying to do. And some vendors certainly fit some use cases better than others. This is the primary means that we use filtering, and we've developed, in fact, our own kind of filtration tools, our decision support tools that we call Real Quadrant, that you can test out on our website, that actually allow you to match up use cases against vendor proclivity and come to the right fit that way, rather than doing these kind of generic scales of who's the best, and who's the worst. Okay. So the third piece of advice gets back to this notion of being empirical and iterative and adaptive, and that is to test, 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 test. So as marketers and marketing IT people, we tend to want to move quickly, and that's good, because we do want to move quickly. At the same time, hopefully what we've learned is that testing and optimization and adaptation are our friend, because sometimes reality teaches us things that we didn't know. So this is, in a sense, an attempt to apply sort of your typical kind of marketing precepts to the task at hand here. Now I see that I'm not sure that I am getting to the right, showing you the right slide. So I am, okay, great, now we are. So let me just start sharing again. All righty. Great, sorry about that. I had a little bit of GoToMeeting interruption, and I'm just gonna stay in this mode here. So I had a little bit of a GoToMeeting quirk that threw me out. So you'll be getting copies of the slides, so you'll be able to see all of this, but basically I'm in section 3. Before that, we were reviewing the CDP use cases here. You may not have seen these on the screen. I'll show them to you here again. These are the 10 use cases we were talking about with CDPs. Typical CDP vendors can excel 3 or 4 of them. The key thing is to match up against the ones that excel with the ones that you have. Okay, so test, test, test. If you do nothing else in this whole process, do not skip the bake-off round. I'm absolutely dumbfounded by the number of large enterprises who should know better, who buy marketing technology without actually trying it out themselves, or they just try out a single vendor, right? And they have the vendor come and demo their use cases. No, what you want to do is, after having gone through this process, you should have a good sense for your user stories. You've honed them over time. What you want to have is a hands-on bake-off, where the first day or two you're getting trained on the platform, and then you're actually having what could be a 3, 4, 5 day week, 5-day sprint with the vendor. And that's how you know whether this tool is what it wants to do, what it struggles to do, what it's going to be like to try to integrate it with some of the other platforms in your environment. This is a challenge. It does take some work, but you come out of it, A, knowing whether the vendor is a good fit, and B, having a much better sense for what it's going to take operationally and technically to be successful with this tool. The alternative is basically, let's say you were going to go drive, you wanted to buy a new car, and maybe it's a really nice car, and you're at this luxury dealership and you're watching the vendor drive it around the parking lot and say, wow, yeah, that looked good, I'll buy it. No, you want to get behind the wheel of the automobile itself, yourself, and drive it around your neighborhood, take it to your local market, park it in your driveway or your garage or in front of your apartment, and actually see, is this going to be a good fit for you? And this is the same thing with technology. So again, I've seen these bake-offs done in as short as 1 day. I've seen them done as in long as 3 weeks, very often for like a CDP or WCM or something like that. Very often a week will suffice. You want to do it with 2 different vendors, one at a time. Has enormous corollary benefits for you in terms of really understanding your requirements, really understanding the sorts of capabilities, really understanding the vendor strengths and weaknesses, and for our purposes, really understanding which of the final 2 is the better fit for you, and by the way, giving you some time to negotiate the right deal. So if you do nothing else, remember to always, always, always have a bake-off. We've been, one of the great pleasures of the last 5 or 6 years or so has been participating in some of these bake-offs, providing bake-off operational templates to some of our subscribers and watching them really unfold with this technology before they actually select it. And it leads to much better implementations, usually much faster time to a pilot. So those were the three main lessons today. If you'd like to learn more, you can always subscribe to our research and advisory services. They come in kind of three different flavors. One is if you're in vendor selection mode, you can subscribe to that stream of research, get access to all of our tooling, and get access to us and our templates and so forth to help you make sure you get to the right decision. Some of our larger subscribers do an entire Omnichannel Stack advisory where they subscribe to all of our research and we help support their stack decision making. And a subset of those have joined this exclusive private peer-to-peer council. We're meeting tomorrow, really excited about that 2-hour meeting where we're going to be talking about omnichannel content. So a lot of ways that you can engage with us. Scott can talk to you about next steps. In the meantime, some questions have come in. If you've got other questions, feel free to add them to the queue and we'll have some time here to take them.
Great, thanks, Tony. And as Tony mentioned, you're welcome to try out the tools right on our website and give it a shot to see what a real quadrant could look like in any of the research areas that we cover, along with the real-time vendor comparison tools. So if you have some vendors in place and you're looking to compare them to marketplace alternatives, leverage those tools. And then if you want to see what a full subscriber experience looks like, just reach out to us, explore@realstorygroup.com. We can walk you through behind the scenes tour and talk you through the options that Tony just mentioned about accessing the research along with our analysts and potentially joining the Stack Leadership Council. In terms of next steps, we have our next webinar is on April 14th. We're going to be talking more through the trends that we're seeing as part of the new MarTech vendor map that we had at the beginning of today's presentation. So please feel free to join us for that. And now I'll turn, looks like there are a couple questions that have come in. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So Dan is asking, when senior leadership are set on a typical bad way to select, like my cousin Vinny, what's a good way to help see them in light for a better method? This is a great question. I think, you obviously can talk about what are the consequences of a failed decision where you don't have the right fit. And so what are the risks there, but also potentially the benefits, and really show them some of the stories about what you're trying to accomplish. And we often find that senior leadership respond to these stories in terms of, yeah, I'd like us to be able to do that. Well, boss, we need to prove it out first that we can actually get there. And I think also finally talking about faster time to market, that when you're much clearer about what you have, you can definitely get to market much faster. James is asking, one challenge I observe is people often have different definitions of the term use case. How do you explain what a use case is? And if people don't get them confused with user stories or sometimes user vignettes, there's a lot of different terms for these things. Sometimes you have the more traditional as a blah, 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 I want to do X, Y, Z. A lot of that can be very feature-based. James, honestly, I'm less concerned about the particular methodology you have, but more that it is a sort of human-centered methodology. In other words, there are real personas actually pursuing a certain journey all the way through. So it tends to be more journey-based, more human-based, and it involves your customers. And anything like that then creates a good story. The other thing is the opportunity to modify those stories as you get smarter. After you see the proposals and the demos, don't be afraid to modify the stories based on what you learn. So that adaptiveness is more important than getting it right up front. James is also asking a really good question. Should buyers expect vendors to offer POCs for free, or for that matter, Bakeoffs? And generally speaking, we find that software vendors will do this for free. Often their services partners cannot. Because the economic models are different there. And so if you bring in a systems integrator, you may have to pay them some. What we always argue is have them propose up front, tell them that this is the plan, going to have this bake-off and then potentially a POC after that, and ask them whether there will be any fee for that. And if there is a fee, that's always something that's negotiable. Often the winning vendor then dispenses with that fee. So there's ways to keep it inexpensive from a customer side. Okay, I know some more questions are coming in, but it is, we've reached the bottom of the half hour, so I wanted to thank everyone for participating. Feel free to reach out to us if anything else comes up in mind. And thanks again for joining us today. For Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne saying so long now.